Hello. Hello and welcome to the RIBA. I'm Eleanor Young, editor of the RIBA Journal, which is the magazine that goes out to you if you're a member, and a website that you can look at anyway. Thank you all for joining us for our first talk in the RIBA VitrA autumn season, the season being Well-Being, Well-Built. We're going to hear about health tonight and see a vision of how better hospitals could be designed to give us healthier communities and buildings that wouldn't bamboozle visitors, but nourish and heal those who need to be in them. We're going to see elegant plans and quite fun plans, sections that appear to be a work of fiction, but Abe Rogers will tell us about the rigorous, evidence-based process that they're drawn from, which is really impressive. And you'll have a chance to listen to Abe in conversation with academic consultant neurologist Dr. Laura Benjamin, one of the collaborators on this project from early stages. What we're looking at is a new type of hospital where architecture is the third carer. Really strong way of thinking about architecture for those of us who sometimes forget that it's got a very positive, almost proactive role to play. After that conversation, please do line up your questions for the two of them. This talk is a very fitting start to the series of talks, which we're running in association with our ongoing partner, VitrA Bathrooms. Thank you, VitrA. We all know that our environment influences us, making us feel better or worse, calm or frenetic, giving us clear, light spaces, giving us a gentle, regular chance for exercise, if we choose to take it, or working against us in damp, dark rooms. We've wrapped all that up in the word well-being now, thus this series with VitrA. And as we kick off with healthcare, it's a reminder that this is not just a nice to have, it's fundamental to our health, and architects and designers can shape those spaces. Not just physical spaces, societal and digital infrastructures too. It's hugely pressing for a society under stress. On the upside, it means that there are some brilliant topics to look out for in the series. I'll just tell you a little bit about those. In just a few weeks away, on the 4th of October, we uncover how architects are designing for people with dementia, a terrible growing number of our population. Also to come are talks on colour, on nature and green spaces, and on the 15-minute city, which many of you will have heard of. We've got its main protagonist, Carlos Moreno, who's going to take us inside the idea and the reality of the localism, the idea of the 15-minute city that's driving reform in Paris and knitting together new neighbourhoods. So, now to introduce Abe Rogers. What you need to know about him is that he was a cabinet maker. He was also a sailor, but for many years he's been doing and teaching design. From starting out as a designer, there have been lively, high-end, high-energy shops, restaurants and hotels. He's got an amazing tons and tons of big cultural names on his client list. Tate Modern to the Capitol Museum of Beijing. But something really touched a nerve when he started working on a Maggie's Centre at London's Royal Marsden Hospital. And I'm pleased that we have someone from Maggie's Centres, I can't quite see her in the audience. And so came Living Systems, which started life as a proposal. It won the Wolfson Economics Prize last year, and so, as I understand it, funding for an in-depth research project into radically improving hospitals, and that's what we are to hear about today. But we're not just leaving this to Abe. In keeping with the methodology of Living Systems, which we'll hear about no doubt, Dr. Laura Benjamin will be in conversation with Abe after his presentation. She's an academic consultant neurologist at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery and at UCL. She's been described rather beautifully as the architect of the brain, thanks to her work in developing a test tube brain to study how viruses enter and cause cardiovascular diseases like stroke and dementia. She's contributed seminal papers on HIV, COVID-19 infections and the brain, and to integrated stroke services. Importantly for this evening, she was also a key advisory member on living systems. So now let's start hearing about that proposal and process. Abe, the stage is yours.
Thank you for such a nice introduction. I might just read the first bit, because otherwise I'm bound to forget some things which I wanted to say at the beginning before we get going, because it's very easy to forget things. So how did we get here? Thank you for coming and to hear about our vision. When I say ours, it really means ours. The Living System Health Centre is the culmination of a massive collective intelligence assembled during our work on the Wolfson Prize. My role throughout has been to drive the process, but also to act as a sponge, absorbing, harvesting the fruit of many conversations to create something of a singular vision. The design is the final product of a long journey that started in 2011 when we were commissioned by the magnificent Maggies to design the centre for the Royal Marsden. It took 7 years from start to completion. You could say slow design. There was a lot of time to learn, experiment, think, experiment, discuss, redesign, and design. During this process, we really discovered the full potential of design, to use the word again, to nurture, support those at their most vulnerable. As well as Maggie's, we've had the privilege of working on a series of projects for the NHS, paediatric wings at St Mary's, neonatal at St Thomas's, the breast cancer wing in Charing Cross, and Queen Charlotte's Hospital, to name a few. Though these projects fall within the last decade or so, I've long believed in the power of the relationship between design and psychology, how objects, environments can affect behaviour, whether in a shop, a restaurant, a gallery or a home, making people laugh, think, sleep, eat, relax. It is beautiful. It is because of these work, both with the NHS and with Maggie's, that I have formed the belief that nowhere can we benefit more from this power than the hospital, where so often the nuances are lost in the pursuit of practical solutions. In 2011, we won the Economic Prize, the Wolfson Economic Prize. It is easy to say now, but it was the result of an intense and truly personal journey. For 9 months, I lived, talked and thought about little but hospitals. I drove those around me mad with my obsession, day and night. I used all I had learned in my career up until now to pour it into the hospital. I talked to an extraordinary collection of experts, doctors, nurses, patients, graphic designers, curators, cultural producers, farmers, engineers, sociologists, social workers and artists in an attempt to understand what was needed and to make the perfect hospital. What I'm going to show you tonight is a result of that journey. I will start by explaining the process of where we are going to go. So I'm going to start talking about the concept of the third carer, and then we're going to pose some questions. How can the hospital become more human-centred, which really seems to be the key to what has got lost in the hospital of today? How can the hospital deliver the art of care to all users? And how can the hospital function as a regenerative tool for its local community? So the notion of the third carer is so simple and so obvious on one hand. If we have the doctors and the nurses who are supporting us and keeping us alive and advising us, and the family comes around us and loves us and helps us, and the friends when they're there, the third carer is the notion of how the building can hold you, the tactility that we can produce from the architecture, how we can use harmonics to create tactile communication with the space. And for this to work, we really have to change the social infrastructure of the hospital as it is today. These are the pillars that we stand by within the notion of the third carer. It must be human-centred. Design will place the human being at the heart of the experience, empowering the individual to take ownership of their mental and physical health, combating the detached, inflexible nature of contemporary hospitals. It must be nature-driven. It will optimise the use of time, space, energy and materials, harness the benefits of biophilia, biomimicry and the positive impact of patient users and staffs. And of course, it must be community-focused. We need to create a movement out of this. We need to bring the community around us. The hospital must be owned by the community, and it must embrace the community and hold them. And it needs to be flexible. We go into, hospitals are built worrying about their immediate costs with no long-term thoughts in how they can change or evolve. Hospitals are full of plasterboard and huge machines, which are clumsy and very difficult to maneuver. But they don't need to be. Times have changed. The machines are so much smaller. We can really have a different way to create a hospital. These are three kind of very key quotes for us from different decades. So much of what we talk about goes back to Florence Nightingale, who is hardly new or necessarily radical. But when she talks about the power of the colour and the object presented to the patient as a means of recovery, as a form of medicine. When Alva Aalto talks how architect can defend man at his weakest, so that we continuously design for the superhero. When Mirana talks about what happens when we confuse price with value, we end up undervaluing care, which is so much the principles of the way we've been building hospitals in the last 20 years. And finally, the late Paul Farmer, who talks of beauty is the right because it is the ultimate vehicle of distribution of dignity. And his passion is how we can bring dignity to those in most need of dignity, particularly looking in the African hospitals. So, we have to start with the hierarchy of the hospital, the government. The hospital must be horizontal. It must be democratic, not vertical and autocratic. We need a hospital which is not owned by centralized government, but a hospital which is owned by the community that it comes out of. We need a hospital that provokes change and believes in health creation as well as health solution. We need a radical hospital, which is the friend of the people. I've been talking a lot with Ash, who's another partner along with Laura Benjamin on the journey and the project. And talking about the real key importance of biopsychosocial, which is a word I find very hard to say, as a model of health, which is really the balance of life. And how this, in fact, becomes an ecology. Maybe it's not holistic, it's about creating this balance. And then we were comparing it between these two vehicles of transport. A sailing boat, which works between the tension of the sea and the wind and is continuously being calibrated to stay afloat and to move efficiently with almost no effort in a kind of seamless process. And the motorboat that plows ahead, kind of ignoring what its conditions are going on until a giant wave comes along and changes things. And the feeling is today, the NHS feels more like the motorboat, and we need to try to make it into the sailboat in some ways. Lighter, more nimble, more agile, and more absorbing. This is the collection of, and the collection goes on, but this is really the kind of key people that we've been working through. So everyone from neurologists to hospital builders, to pediatric doctors, to sleep specialists, to virtual reality in the hospital, to cultural producers, and to really brilliant engineers. So today I'm not going to talk about engineering, partly because I'm in RIBA and I know there's a lot of architects in the house who probably will frown at my naivety. But more importantly, because this is really a story of space and tactility and relationship. But the key to the kind of our perspective is that the engineering should be modest and intelligent. And the rooftop should not be for the services, but for the people. So this is the kind of hospital that we're trying to create. No basement, no car park to start with. The basement is the most consumer of carbon of all areas in the architecture. A marketplace to really talk to the local community. A marketplace which acts as a dissolve between the hospital and the people. A marketplace which means when the doctors and the patients come up and down, they can go through a situation of fresh vegetables. And a market that supplies food to the hospital. But more than a market, a communal kitchen, alternative medicine, primary care, a hubbub of activities that starts on ground level, which communicates more than the hospital. Accident and emergency, which is still quite necessary. And they do need cars, so we cannot pedestrianise them. But then we put an innovation centre, and we have hospital overflow staff. And then we have a raised park for many activities, softer, recreational activities, a cafe, a reception, outpatients, ICU, and then wards. And all the way through, everyone has a little garden to come out of. Because as Richard, my dad, said probably on this floor. It is the human right that everyone should be able to see a tree through their window. So here you can see a little tree. And then on top, a rooftop garden, an urban allotment that can supply vegetables that come back down. And we've seen the amazing work that's going on in the hospital kitchens in places like Sheffield at present. And it's kind of going back to that as a notion. So to go to the beginning, Maggie's where we started working with Laura and Marsha. And for us, Maggie's was about creating a tactile building which was full of porosity, where you can always see your way in and see your way out, where there's no formality. And the sense of empowerment that people coming from the hospital, where they are impotent, and into the Maggie's, where they are empowered, is extraordinary. This celebration of life, a beaking heart, parked inside a car park, parked inside a Pete Aldorf garden. Being able to see right through the building is so important. It stops you from feeling claustrophobic. Being able to watch the shadows pass, something you so seldom can see in a hospital. Being able to see light from every angle. No corners, things flowing, the body is not square. Why should the space? The communal kitchen, the communal garden. I'm not so much celebrating our architecture, but the Maggie's brief, and how that inspires this change in nature. And then, of course, the toilet, which becomes an escape, a place to go and cry, where you can lock a door.
I'm here because
this is just a quick interview about people using Maggie's, shot on a rainy day, so it's good to see the places rain at
we're
times.
Here as an outpatient, supporting her with my wife and her boyfriend, and we are here regularly, sometimes 2 or 3 times, even 4 times a week, and we look forward always to come to the Maggie Centre.
Cancer diagnosis or a serious illness diagnosis, a space like this does, I don't know, it just really makes you feel a bit better. I have to have a lot of appointments, for example, and I definitely really feel so much happier that I'm able to come and wait here rather than the waiting rooms.
I'm here because I've got prostate cancer, and I was diagnosed in December last year, so I'm still getting to understand what is happening. I didn't realize this was actually a building you could go into. I thought maybe it was a storage thing. And so when the gentleman told me, oh, if you need somebody quiet, somewhere quiet, you can go into this place. I'm like, what is it? Where is it sending me to? And when I opened the door, I was like, wow. I was just like, wow, what do they have in here?
The building, in my mind, is wonderful. It's sort of so bright and opening, and I love the fact that you've got windows everywhere. You always seem to be connected to the outside. I wouldn't have got through the last few years, particularly with COVID, without Maggie's.
People always comment on the door handles and just how nice they are to sort of hold. And
so the first question is, how can the hospital become more human-centred? These are scout photographs we've taken from projects we're working on. They're not critical as such, but they're just the current situation. Corridors which are full of machines which save lives, but they really don't make you feel calm. And if you're at the moment of stress, it doesn't help you feel empowered. Just wires everywhere, activities everywhere. Information overload. So there's so much information, you can't read any information, and no system to present it. So, we come from this background of designing retail, designing spaces, creating creating communication systems to help shoppers, for example. This is Selfridges in the Manchester Bullring, designed originally by Future Systems on the outside. And it's a very simple scheme where we just bring everything back to the atriums. We're clearing all the clutter away so we can see right across the barriers. And then we're rubbing off the corners. As we say, the human body is not square. But it makes shopping feel lighter. It's less frantic. It's less, why can't the hospital learn from this? The Tate Modern, you know, we want them to donate. So the one piece of communication is about donating as you enter the space. You know, we created all the public concourses. There's no graphics except the handwriting of Sarah Finelli that runs across the whole space and these collection of objects. Maybe it's easier to tell people about the history of time than it is to tell them about how to get around in a hospital. Or Comme des Garçons, where we created a kind of ante-room with spinning cubes to prepare people to go to the radical fashion as a sort of in-between space. You know, this changes the way that you feel. It's really hard not to smile when you sit on a fiberglass cube and turn around and to be in this space which is full of red. I was waiting for her to come and sit down, so thank you. In fact, this is showing a kitchen I designed Conway back in 2001. Or Kenya Hara, who did take this thinking to a hospital in Tokyo. And it's extraordinary. And he does two extraordinary things here, I believe. One is he creates absolute clarity in how you get from left and right. Also, he proves how clean the hospital is by using linen for the signage. So the notion being, if you can keep your signage clean, your hospital is clean. I'm not sure this is quite where NHS is at the moment. So the hospital we're describing looks something like this. We're very lucky to have Yoski in the studio who does all these amazing drawings. And so we have these little pocket parks, the urban allotment, the Risen Park here in the city all around us. So we knew we wanted the hospital to be circular in order to really in order to not get lost. It's hard to get lost in a circle, even for me. And we knew we wanted everyone to have these views. So we had a circle and we just put the beds around it. You would soon run out of space. So we start to create these petals with these beds that come out. But then we start to look at how the light will get into the space, how far the light will break through. And we rapidly realized that the north is never going to give you the daylight that we are after. So we say, okay, maybe this is offices. So the top is about penetration and the bottom is about warmth of light. So then we come up with this plan, like a flower with these petals and these little gardens that sit in between. But then we realized we can't have every floor with a garden because we won't have enough light hitting the plant. So we go every 2 floors along the way. And then to get light into the core, we scoop out a chunk and plant a tree because you can't have enough trees. So we have the podium, we have the park, we have the tower, and we have the pocket gardens. And what this achieves is after all the disturbance we've done to the land, we end up with a park as big as the site. And it's absorbed the building. So I think it's quite clever. Services, public, A&E. So this is how you enter the building. It's pulling the community into the center. And then coming straight up from A&E into the building, and then the public up as well. So here we have the section of our very buildable hospital with all its activities like a mini city. The market, the A&E with auxiliary sitting in between it. Services, overflow of administration, and then the park, which really things come to life. So all these different activities going on, one on top of the other, to create this architecture. And then all this porosity on ground level that pulls us through, that makes the hospital part of the community, makes the hospital the friend of the people, makes people wanting to work in the hospital. So ground level, as we say, we have the market, we have the, and then we go up in order to get to where the laboratories are happening, and we're trying to be inventive and bring energy to the space. And then we have pharmacies at the top, which almost are kind of coming out of the laboratories. And then we have this overflow space of work. But the raised park is which I think becomes really interesting, because this becomes a place which is owned by the people. It is a public park, but it is also completely owned by the hospital. So it's this dual relationship. We have, we have daycare centre for the children. Whilst you're going to see the hospital, you can deposit your children. We have a restaurant. We have a restaurant kitchen. We have a hospital kitchen. There's a lot of kitchens. We have coffee shop, bereavement centre. You know, I think the hospital really needs to talk more about life and death. And so often the death is hidden away, and we turn our back onto it. And we really want to bring that to the forefront, to make a process. When people die in hospitals, they often end up in a fridge with a tablecloth over them disguised. Where is the ceremony in that? Why do we hide it away so much? Why can't the gymnasiums that we're creating for physiotherapy become gymnasiums that the local community uses? Why can't the local community swim in the pool? All the time dissolving the barrier between what is civic and what is hospitals. And therefore demystifying it, making it more, and then also using the expertise that comes with that joy. And then we go upstairs, and the hospital rapidly gets assembled. So we start with intensive care. We start to use the flower to be populated by all its activities. We have nurse stations that can see continuously where the patients are and how they're doing. We have the incredibly complexity of the very, very hard-working surgeries going on. But then when you come out of these surgeries, I think at one point we looked at putting them in the basement, and it was so obvious that it was the last place that they should be. When you come out of surgery, you need to see daylight. The team needs to see daylight. They need a sense of recovery, a place to go. So it's about creating these habitats. Each floor becomes like a small city. You can see across on the right the different activities going on. I mean, we've really based this on the activities of a hospital in order to create this different flow. But you can also see how hard it is to get lost, even for the most loss-making person. And getting lost in a hospital is really stressful. And all the time we're trying to reduce stress in order to speed up recovery, or at least create comfort when recovery is not possible. So we have the surgical team, the nurses, and their activities. Of course, the patients are quite static in this situation. So here you're kind of looking out at the windows, you're starting to feel these different worlds. You have these balconies to escape on. And your trees growing continuously. And you have these staff rooms for breaking out spaces. And anyone working in a hospital knows there is no space for staff. But there are space for big machines. And so I'm sure we can find different ways to spin the space, to be more loving to the workers, to increase the comradeship, to bring it all to life. So this is two surgeons having come out of their surgery, sitting on the balcony, recovering from the operation in a sense of dignity and life and space. Then we go up to the general ward floor, where we see the atrium coming in. And we have the beds pacing out. We have these little social spaces. You know, one of the really important things that we're trying to do in the hospital is to break to create a hospital clock, to break the monotony, to get away from the fluorescent light, to understand shadow, to see days passing, to feel space and time going on. So these being able to have social spaces to get outside into the garden, however ambient, however able, movable you are, is so important. So we start to create these different flows, the green being the food services. Every floor has a kitchen, which sounds radical, but it's quite done. You see it in Alderhay, and you're starting to see it in Sheffield as well. And these simple flows of traffic as people go by. And then, so you come up out of the lift, and you go straight into the reception desk. And you go off to outpatients or down to the wards. And in outpatients, again, you have these waiting rooms. You know, when we're designing a breast cancer waiting room, 1 in 10 people in that room is going to discover they've got cancer. So it needs, you know, the fact that we treat them so hostilely, so with such hostile seating is really complex. We need to make them feel comfortable. We need to reduce people's stress. So by creating a space where you're not looking in each other's eyes, where you have some level of distraction, where you have a balcony to escape in, is so incredibly important. And then, this idea of having these kitchens on each floor where you have the smell of people cooking. We're trying to really get people to engage in their senses. And that is what is so important. And of course, we're bringing color and activities and tactility into these spaces and trying to challenge the use of the kind of materiality. So then we took 2 briefs that we have in the studio, one from pediatrics and one from neonatal, to see what would happen if we applied these briefs to this architecture. And it was relatively straightforward to adapt the forms to the functions to these spaces, which somehow proved the legitimacy of the architecture. And then onto the rooftop, where we have this urban allotment that starts to feed the building. But also it starts to create a different activity in the hospital. We suddenly have gardeners in the hospital. And when we have gardeners, we have volunteers. And we have people coming up and coming through, people with different types of experience. And then also we have staff offices and staff welfare spaces. We're not allowed to call it a bar because that would be encouraging people to drink. But it could be a bar if you wanted it to be a bar. When we tested this with some of the user groups, there was huge rise about people jumping off the top of it, which is a thing. I guess you have to build very high glass, and that this is a hospital, and there is issues of. But I think if we start to reduce everything to the lowest common denominator, then it's really hard to move forward. So we have to find ways to prevent it, or we find ways to. Well, I'm not going to be naive. So we move on. How can the hospital deliver the art of care to all its users? Again, we start with the hospital as it is now. The state of the food. These are the kind of waiting rooms that I'm talking about. If you sit in these spaces, you feel really uncomfortable. You feel really scared. This is an office which becomes a ward. Everything, because they're so short of space, everything gets dual functioned. There's clutter of information that we continuously see. And then we go back to Maggie's and we look at the calm that we create in Maggie's, the calm that we create in these spaces, the use of color, the use of light, the use of a tree, and a nice rug. I'm not saying we should have a nice rug in the hospital. They're quite infectious. But I am saying we should be able to have wood in a hospital because I think it is a complete mythology that wood carries bacteria more than steel. In the test that we've done, it seems to point very much in the opposite direction. But there is a complacency in belief in plastic. Plastic, as soon as you scratch it, it becomes really quite a toxic material. So this is really looking at how... This is an exhibition we designed for Spectrum, for FSB door handles, in '97. And just by attaching a music to each door handle, the relationship of the user and the door handle completely changed. So why can't we take this thinking and apply it to the hospital? I'm not saying every door handle should have a sound, but I'm saying we can do things that make people smile. We can do things that create surprise. We can borrow things from other culture. And Spectrum was a really tedious show at times, and people were really not looking that. And suddenly to have a stall where people laughed was completely transformative to the experience. These are not actors, these are genuine people laughing in the Royal College in '97, or maybe '98. So we just hacked their alarm systems and put these little sounds attached to them. And this was for Glasgow '99 for Diane. We just made a roof that would move around in coordination where you were. Not being still. Why should the roof always be still in order to change your emotion? It's true that it made you quite neurotic. You don't want people to be more neurotic than they already are. But this is the point of how it can affect the psychology of the space and the play that they do. And why can't we kind of bring this type of thinking into the architecture of a hospital? When we first did it, it went twice as high, and the curator said no, so we did slow it right down. Or the 8-4 of St Mary's, which has the Bridget Rileys in, which completely overpower anything you put inside them. And suddenly the scariest hospital implements disappear and become very secondary. And the worst wayfinding, you don't really notice that it's a really scary sign. You just see this extraordinary color. It drives the hospital mad because they have to repaint it every 2 years, and only a very specific mural artist, of course, can come in and do it. But the power is extraordinary, the power of art in these spaces. So this is just a collection of quotes which really deal with these problems. Care in the hospital, life and death in the hospital, from birth to death, the importance of calm, hospital patients and empowerment, etc. These both being patients. But they talk about the fear of boredom, the patients. They talk about needing to escape. Some of them talk about wanting somewhere dark to hide, not wanting to be seen by the other people. It was fascinating, this research from all the angles. And in our process, we would continuously, to go back to the collective stage, we would continuously put ideas forward, and then we would put them through these filters, and we would discover that the solution to the hospital was not a bath in every room, which was one of my ideas at some point, or was not to fill it full of pot plants, or many others. I'm just taking the most literal. And we would be continuously redesigning through the filtration of these doctors, nurses, patients, engineers, sociologists, cultural producers. So we arrive in our new hospital, and we have a piece of colour straight out of the lift. We can see daylight behind us. It's a relaxing space. It's an inspiring space. Okay, we're going to have a horrendous operation. I can't stop that. But at least we can nurture you en route to that journey. At least we can make you feel a little bit more comfortable as you go along. And into the hospital room, which starts to feel much more domestic. Let's think about the ceiling, what's happening on the ceiling. That's what you're going to be looking at. Just singular, we do it on a herringbone, so you're not looking eye to eye. You can talk to your neighbour, and it's really important. And I believe statistically, it is much safer, or a bit safer, to be in a ward than a single room because of the protection of the patients. It's true that most of us want to be in a private room because of the craziness that goes on in a collective. But the socialising that happens can be really important part of the process. Space for chairs, for doctors to come, for your friends, and places to store things so it can become your space. The tactility of timber, simple linoleum floors. But then working with sound, we're talking about disturbing maybe this can be a bit louder. We're talking about disturbing the hospital clock. We're talking about disturbing the people's journey. There's a friend of mine, Nick Luscombe, in Japan, who's working on a project where he's piping sound straight from the fields of Japan into the hospital. Obviously not non-stop, cows mooing, but you press a button and the cows moo, which is quite a nice thing. You have birds waking up at 6 in the morning rather than the beeping of the patient next door to you. I'm talking of the beeping. Why can't the beeping be in the pocket of the doctor rather than sitting for all else to hear? Because that's what makes us so neurotic. And I'm not saying that your feet should always be uncovered, but this idea of, thinking about what you're seeing from the hospital bed, looking out of the window beyond the feet at this tree, this gorgeous tree that is growing, and these birds, and then we're planting bird boxes, and hopefully real birds will come, and maybe the real birds will talk to the synthetic birds, or maybe the synthetic birds are real birds but just recorded. So this, we want privacy. You pull your bed down, and as soon as you're horizontal, you can't see your neighbour. The curtain comes across. Using timber, using these materials, we can create very sound-absorbing acoustics. We worked a lot with an acoustician, Sergio, from en route with this, who really helped us reduce the sounds, make everything more cosy. You pull the curtains are different colours, but also what we're saying is that everyone needs to be local. We can't farm out the cleaning. If the cleaning is local and it's part of the hospital, then it becomes a community. And they take away the curtains with pride, and they clean them beautifully, rather than making them of synthetic fabrics and destroying them on a kind of bi-monthly basis. If the food is brought in by profiteering, centralized groups, it is a very different experience from having a chef who is cooking the vegetables from on the roof. Okay, in the winter he needs to import a few vegetables, but he can do so from the market downstairs. So then out into the pocket park, in your bed. Everything has wheels in our hospital of the future, by the way. So you wheel out to the garden. with blankets to stay cool. You know, during COVID, we saw in Plymouth, there's an IC unit with a garden, and I think the increase was the speed of recovery was 40% improved. Now, I know there's lots of doctors say, so my statistics could be quite wrong, but it was a significant improvement, whichever way. So I can't talk about engineering, and I can't talk about doctors, but you know, we sit somewhere in between. And then these social spaces, which you can come with your family, or you can come, or you can come with other patients, or you can come with a doctor and have a conversation. So we're trying to create different types of environments. You're not going into these little cupboards to have these conversations. You know, we're trying to create a hospital which feels like Maggie's. Downwater pipes that collect, which supply structure and collect the water and distribute it. Little bird houses which attract the birds and bring them to the habitat. The more trees and more trees. You know, and it really feels quite pleasant to be out in this hospital. And I think, you know, you're calmer, and you're going to be ill better if you're calmer, and recover quicker if you're going to recover. But not everyone wants to have these single rooms. The new build program is really pushing to have single rooms rather than shared wards. So we have to have a system, but we can't go into buildings ripping down plaster walls. It's so inefficient. It's so disgusting, the dust, everything. It's so wasteful. So we're looking at a very simple modular system of CLT, dry panels, risers at the end of each petal, spread through the roof, so we can really change these spaces around. So from a single room to private rooms to isolation rooms. Now, of course, it's more than pressing a button, but we can do this dry. We don't need to close down the whole floor. We can come in, we can reconfigure in much easier ways. We can reduce waste. We can use the system across many hospitals. Here are the little risers popping up, going through. The structures are very modest, you know, so we're not wasting loads of energy. And these are the three different formats that we're working across with different colors, because we love playing with colors. And you can see the little pocket gardens and how pleasant they are. And then across to the outpatients and waiting for your appointment in somewhere which feels so different, where you're watching the plants grow, where you're absorbing the northern light, where you have space to think, and a space very similar for the doctors and the nurses and the staff to hang out, which is so different from those cupboards that we saw at the beginning. I keep using the word cupboards. But you know, you can breathe, you can express this feeling of timber that wraps all around. You know, sleep is a really important thing, and sleep in the hospital is especially important. Doctors who don't have sleep often make mistakes. You know, and we're trying to keep people as active and intelligent as possible. So we need them to be able to sleep. Nurses likewise. So we create these little couchettes, soundproofed, half an hour, no one disturbs you until whatever is agreed happens. You hang up your little clothes. But we know that space is so premium that we convert it into an office by day or by night, depending when the office is needed. Then up onto the rooftop where we're doing our gardening, where we're enjoying the space, we're paying back to the hospital, this civic relationship between the plants, the hospital, the volunteers, the gardeners, these different activities, which is so not what a hospital is about. But they're caring for the plants are caring for you. We're creating this community of care, the art of care, which is so kind of key to the work we're trying to do. And then this is these staff spaces where you sit and stare out of the glass. You look across the city. You talk to the janitor talks to the doctor talks to the nurse. The cook comes in, the gardener's there, everyone's having a conversation. Things are changing. In this system, everyone can save a person. We're trying to really break away from this vertical hierarchical system where, it used to be said that the doctor is God, or the architect is God, and trying to create this much more democratic, softer system where we're all part of an ecosystem. We're all part of an ecology. We're all about balance and trying to balance the solution. We worked with Dan Pearson a lot, and I think this is a really beautiful quote of his. The benefits of landscape and garden offer us when we're healthy: beauty, contemplation, energy, connection, food, contact with nature. Seasonal cycles and processes are magnified 100 times when we are ill. And he worked on these gardens very much looking at the small tower as being a mountain, and using appropriate plants around the mountain as they grew. So then finally, how can the hospital function as a regenerative tool for its local community? So what can we do to really talk to the community and to bring people in? How can we learn from the church and the cathedral of the past? How can we make something that feels more friendly, more welcoming, something more regenerative in so many of its words? You know, there is no public realm in the majority of hospitals, and a lot of these hospitals are not built so long ago. And it's all you feel is the cars as this barrier, the smoking. There's no love, there's no care in these spaces. Of course, we need the ambulances. We can't get patients in there. But there is a different way to deal with the people, with the humans. You know, we look at the role that the Tate Modern has made, how it's changed the nature of the art museum in the city, how it has dissolved the barriers, and it's become something for all people. You know, what can the hospital learn from this as a kind of a new typology? Or the Pompidou, you know, embracing the city, allowing the city in, becoming so much part of the way the city worked. Or much earlier, St. Paul's, you know, how it got how it built for the people, the generosity, the takeover. The markets, which we keep talking about, I keep talking about, you know, how we can use the market to really stir people, to really get people engaged in the city. So this really is looking both from Publica and from Mando at how, you know, the power of the hospital as a community tool, the hospital as a place to anchor, not as a place to be frightened of, something that is embracing the city and its users. So these are kind of a series of diagrams looking at how we can absorb into different spaces, trying to kind of bring the whole structure together to make it really real. And here we start to see, it's kind of back to the beginning, but it's this building, as Ernie has always talked about with excitement of how generous it is to the buildings that are around it. And okay, we've made them particularly black and dark, the buildings around us, and we're so light and colourful. But we start to see these green corridors that link us together. We see all the pedestrianised around the area. We see all the generosity of the park. And again, you know, what Ernie is always talking about is how we have lost no sight. The building is absorbed by the park. The building becomes part of the park. No basement, no car park, direct pedestrian access, green corridors, market, A&E, primary care. Increasing the relationship between the hospital and the city. Breaking those boundaries, softening the effect. Does this look like a hospital that we've been looking at? You know, this feels like a carnival. It feels like a festival. Well, I hope so. This is what we're trying to do. You know, these green avenues that take us, the green corridors that bring the green in, you know, birds flying around, coming in, the closeness to nature. You know, coming out of COVID, everybody's been talking about this feeling of how important it is to feel nature, and nowhere more than when you're sick in hospital. But also we start to create this carnival and this festival, then people are going to go up and visit other people in the hospital. The hospital becomes alive. It is no longer feared. It is it's part of the community. We dissolve the kind of centralized governance and we start to be owned by the community that's there. And we see a completely different relationship between the hospital and the people, between the citizen and the patient. After all, the citizen becomes the patient quite rapidly. and hopefully returns to being the citizen. You know, if we can increase the public realm, there's no reason why the road has to consume the whole hospital. If we can keep it into a neat corner, we can have a sense of order, we can have a sense of architecture that protects and defends the people, whilst not losing the efficiency of the ambulance. We decided that red ambulances were more elegant than green. The green was not working with all the other green. And then there's transparency of activities going on. You know, it's more than about fixing broken bodies. It's about health creation, social prescription, activation. And this comes to the front as you're heading over to the market, and everyone is on a bicycle or carrying a dog. So there must be some cars because of zebra crossings. And then back up to the park and the activities and the gardener. But while you're doing your rehabilitation in this kind of space, it's a very different feeling from being in tarmac or locked indoors in windows that can't open. And finally, we're here at the end of the journey, and the building is built with its very modest structure. It's maybe quite a lot of weight to support up on the tops. It's pocket gardens. It's being consumed by the park and the people that use it. And for me, maybe that is the most important thing. I'm not sure where I am on time, but.
Slightly out of my comfort zone, a room full of architectures and a firing squad Rogers full of colour. But it's a pleasure to be here, and Abe, thank you for asking me to join you. Yes, astounding work and inspiring stuff, and clearly a labour of love. That's certainly what emerges through your talk and meeting you and being involved in this whole project. I think you've been quite modest. I was fortunate and privileged enough to be part of the interview panel for the Wolfson Prize. And I can tell you firsthand that it was quite competitive, the group of people that we're competing with. The panel were quite intimidating. We had lords, we had CEOs, we had dames, and one of which is here. And the prize itself is quite an important prize. And I know about Wolfson, and I know they're a philanthropic organisation, but I had to Google it. And I Googled, how prestigious is Wolfson Prize? And this is what I came back. The second largest economic prize in the world after the Nobel Prize. So quite something. So I think you've been modest, and I think it's important to set the context. So I'm going to start with a question. It's quite clear, you talk about the collective intelligence, and it's quite clear that you've been doing this for a very long time, including the time with Maggie's, and got some experience from that. You mentioned being a sponge, you mentioned harvesting information, but someone had to put that together, someone had to build that narrative. I'm sure a lot of the things that people told you ignored. Wow. So I want to know how you built that up, got all the ingredients to develop this living system, and where you drew your inspiration from.
I think we drew, I don't think we did ignore that much information. I mean, maybe if someone said something which didn't like blue, maybe it would have ignored that. But I think generally, we really used the information that we harvested and gathered to shape the project and to build on it. And in a way, the more tactility you have, the more information, the more stuff that you have to go into a brief, the richer the brief can become. I think as designers, when we are given a completely blank piece of paper, we can become very indulgent. And I think using a very rich sponge, or a very rich collective to sponge from, stops us being so indulgent, and it applies some rigor to the system. But the building did really change in an unrecognizable way from when we started with this very simple circle kind of ambition. And as we had to have a starting point somewhere. But But it was, you know, it was really navigating, to go back to the boating metaphor, it was really navigating through quite a complex sea and trying to keep the boat upright all the time as more stuff was gone in or took out, or things which wouldn't work, or things which wouldn't.
But, you know, as I'm just going to give a list of names of people. You've mentioned them through the presentation. You have myself and Ash, who are neurologists and neuroscientists involved in this, 2 for the price of 1. Helen Starr, digital VR creative producer. Dan Pearson, landscape designer. Magda Mustafa, autism design specialist. You had a professor of acoustics, Sergio Luzzi, broadcaster, radio producer, and sound collector, Nick Luscombe, who you showed there with that beautiful music. Javier Botella, who's an economist at Tesco's, and your lovely wife Anna as well, creative producer and programmer. You know, that's a lot of people and information to try and navigate and build into this wonderful piece.
A lot of opinions. But I think, but that's also why, I mean, it became this singular obsession of just driving this through and trying to use all this information and all these opinions. But there was also, you know, also being super neurodiverse, there was moments when there was just a real overload of information and words.
Of course,
and it was my editing team and the cultural producers, people like Francesca Bozzolotti and Stuart Bailey and Anna, who really picked up my pieces and with all these funny words and put them together in an order that would make sense of the project.
And then something that you did that you probably didn't realise, in the sense of all these interviews we were having with people, creating themes, effectively having a focus group discussion and asking questions and questions until saturation, and you start getting themes. And I suspect those themes help you drive a lot of what you've got
completely.
here.
I think those themes, which you so eloquently called them, were really essential part of, in order to get some clarity of where we were to take it. And I think with so much information, we had to, you know, I really don't like boxes and walls and corners, but we had to put them in boxes in order to stop everything becoming a blancmange.
And I remember one question, one of the first questions you asked me in one of these meetings was, how can we help you improve your experience in the hospital? And I can just pause for a second, taken aback, because I don't think I've ever been asked a question like that before. And I suspect many healthcare professionals who are in the audience will probably agree with me in that sense, that, you know, the hospital doesn't often work for the providers. It's just, here you are, deal with it. So it was really nice to ask that. And one of the things I can remember mentioning was camaraderie, and how that's something that has been lost over time. I think the rooftop garden was one of the inspirations from that.
Okay, well, you talked very eloquently about COVID and how camaraderie had been reborn during the time of COVID, and how soon as the COVID had started to fix itself, it had been forgotten and the whole program had got lost, so
important.
If I remember along the journey. But I think, you know, we've been working in the Churchill Hospital in Oxford, which was built in 2011 as a PFI, and it's super not fit for purpose. It's just shocking that someone would build such a building. But when I spoke to the doctors and said, what was the process? They said, we were all showing the building, and when we said this isn't going to work, they said it's too late for discussion, we're building it anyway. Yeah. And so, you know, we talk about economics, the waste of money to build something which is obsolete before it is born is really, really scandalous.
And that's going to take me to the patients. So we talked about healthcare providers. And I can remember you had a chat with them and you looked traumatized afterwards. It seemed to have had a transformative impact on you. Would you like to share with us what you learned and how that helped change?
I think when we had many patient groups that we would talk to, but lots of them were friends of us, friends of, you know, of people who had been ill at the time and going and own experiences of hospital and patients. But suddenly talking to some really professional hospital patients, I think they're called professional hospital patients, or anyway, whatever the terminology, which is really hardcore sex workers, drug abuse, homeless, people who have been in and out of hospitals all their lives. Their position was super different, and was you know, the need to hide. You know, we're trying to make everything really beautiful and transparent and light, and so suddenly this need to have very personal spaces where you could retreat to. The fear of the way you smell and how other people might think of you the nervousness about this exotic food. They loved the gardening idea, but then also a lot of fear about people jumping off these balconies, which is, we didn't take the balconies out, but it is something very, prevalent in our minds from that position. But then also they really appreciated this smaller scale, not being the softer acoustics, having things that would distract you, the idea of kind of being able to be social when you wanted to be social.
And there was something about, was it darkness or lightness?
Yeah, darkness.
Yes.
The want for darker spaces.
Yeah. And did you adapt that?
We did adapt. We did make some darker spaces.
I think that's an important demonstration of inclusivity. And by speaking to those underrepresented people who often use the health service, you were able to accommodate the ideas into it, which is great.
We also had a long conversation right at the beginning with an amazing video artist called the Vacuum Cleaner, James the Vacuum Cleaner, who'd been working in Newham, who came with, and Newham, the teenage mental health ward is built right on top of the motorway, and the hell that this would cause the kids with autism and this continuous sound driving past them, and why this hadn't been kind of thought about in architecture. And then he made all these extraordinary films around patients during COVID and the isolation, these experiences. They were really harrowing. And it's kind of, there's a lot of harrowing material out there. Sorry, I don't want to go into it.
I think there's so much to talk about, Abe. It's difficult to know where to start. But I can remember when we were in the interview, and I think you probably clinched it at this point here, when someone asked you about space. Because certainly you show that eloquently, those pictures of how not so comforting those spaces were. The UCLH hospital right next to a main road, and nowhere to reach out. And also within the actual hospital itself, there's no space to expand and no flexibility at all. I can remember UCLH I'm saying that because Familiarity was built in 2004. 2 years later, I was working there, and at that point, they had problems with space. So when they asked you the question of how are you going to deal with space, it was exciting to hear from me. It was exciting to hear your response because you clearly thought about it within the hospital and also outside the hospital. But would you like to expand on that? You kind of touched on it in the room.
Well, I suppose, I think by creating really flexible interiors which are completely dismantleable and can be redistributed is the kind of main way that we saw it. We have quite modest structures, but we have spans, so the petals stay very, very clear. And within that, there's a whole kind of divisible system of partitioning. But then also in the main market below, we have these 2 huge stories, which are really flexible spaces, which can absorb different things for in emergency situations. We wouldn't want, like a COVID situation, or but they become these flexible auxiliary spaces.
And it's very real, because COVID has actually just shown how you need those spaces to change quickly, whether you need the community cohorting or you need the negative pressure rooms. You need that flexibility, and often we don't have that. So
I suppose what we've tried to do is create a very bespoke plan, which is designed around the view out, but everything inside that is completely free. And so there is potential to move. It is not easy to extend it. You can add a few more layers on top if you want to.
Yeah, and that's important, to extend up as well. So one of the reasons why you snared my interest, he talks about the church being the centre of the community of a village. And you wanted to try and represent that in a hospital, where the hospital is the centre of the community, which I thought was a beautiful concept and analogy. And I also remember you saying something about something like this being somewhere like East London, where it could start regenerating an area and a community. Do you want to expand on that a little bit more?
Well, I think the church analogy very much came out of the conversation around the table. I think Manda, who's here, very much posted that and wrote an essay about it. Being very atheist, they always make me nervous as a starting point. But when you look at the relationship within the city, of course, it's so incredibly important. And Esther will always talk about the Duomo in the centre of any Italian city, and how that brings the city together, and it becomes this place. And so if we can slightly morph what the hospital represents, and if it's not just about fixing broken bodies, but it's also about trying to really fix the community itself, we can, one, it becomes a really powerful employer. Two, it starts to become somewhere that you go to for all these additional activities, the market, the garden, the osteopath, the physiotherapist, the primary care, the community kitchen. So it's trying to go beyond, it's trying to, you know, when you, GPs these days are using a lot of social prescription, so why can't the social prescription become part of, be supplied by these spaces?
And it's the library and the bank, which,
Yeah.
which you can't underestimate if you're working 9 to 5. For any health career, you can't get to the bank, but if you have that there, the community is easily accessible. And he also talked about, you know, the community enjoying the use of the gardens, enjoying the use of producing, contributing to the kitchens, and so it becomes a whole
that
ecosystem.
kind of generosity is what we talked a lot about, and getting everybody becoming involved in the garden is such a powerful way of absorbing these different energies and different needs.
Yeah, absolutely. But I thought that was really nice. And then the elephant in the room is always cost. And it's something that, you know, you can gloss over, but it's always difficult.
It's really cheap. Our hospital won't cost very much.
Yeah, no.
No, I think the cost is such a ridiculous thing, the way we talk about cost within the hospital context or any of these contexts, because it's about what's working. And if you build a really cheap hospital and it doesn't work and it's out of date within 10 minutes, it's really not a big saving. I think we have to look at kind of some long-term solutions. We have to be willing to invest money into something which will move and adapt and work over time. You know, when we're doing a project in Patworth, which was a 1930s kind of hospital of the future, and the bones of that building are fantastic still, and it completely stands strong. Why it's derelict, I don't know. But compared to the 2000 the hospital's circular of 2000, which are just built with such a crazy methodology, with this PFI contracts as their basis, which is really not working for the people that they're working for. And these hospitals are not asking the people working in them how they want them to be. And I think that's a real failing of the hospital situations. So I think I think a hospital like ours, over a period of time, will become incredibly economical, because we will see retention of staff, we will see speed of recovery, we will see much more satisfaction, we'll see greater reduction in heating costs, etc., etc. Was it 1 to, yeah, I forget the statistic because I'm not an economist.
But it's also the value added as well. It's also the well-being, people feeling happier, you know, staying in hospital for a shorter period of time.
Wanting to come back because the food was so good.
Coming back for the right reasons for the food and not for the wrong reasons because they've relapsed. Those are, and even in research, we often find it very difficult to enumerate those things which are completely invaluable, which make such a difference. The happiness of the providers, and because they're happy, because they provide better care, there are less complaints, there's less administrative burden. So it's that value that you're selling, really.
Well, I think David Powell's hospital in Alderhay, he has the paediatrics has a kitchen in every ward, and one chef cooks 32 kids. And in 5 years, they've never had a complaint.
Yeah.
Not a single complaint.
But it's somewhat changing the system where you're basing it more on value, which is softer and difficult to often enumerate, rather than the hard outcomes.
Yeah, no, I think.
And I think that's an important concept that you're also trying to sell here, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
indeed. Life is for living.
As in, we all know the NHS is at breaking point, and it needs inspirational projects, innovative ideas to try and galvanize it. You know, if without prohibitive costs, it's wonderful, but with prohibitive costs, then, you know, there is value added that will be gained in the long term. This is wonderful, and it'd be wonderful to try and integrate a lot of these concepts into the National Health Service. How do you think you can make this a reality? What steps? I suspect some of it has to be baby steps, but what steps can you take to get this make this happen in reality?
I think there's different, again, when we're looking in Oxford at the moment, we're kind of, rather than trying to deal with the architecture, which is so clumsy and so, if you started, you'd be there forever, we're trying to design objects which can create the dignity. Because the big problem is in situations where you have people having chemotherapy in a corridor and there's no privacy of acoustic or of anything. You can hear, you're being told that you're dying and the person next door to you can hear, and in that hour that we spent there, we could really hear these conversations. And everyone's, looking, it's a really unpleasant experience. But if we can design a piece of furniture which can give them some intimacy and can give them some empowerment, so they can spin in a chair and they can have some protection, not unlike a club class scenario, then we can kind of start to create protection, choice, empowerment. And it's that ability to be empowered which is so important. And that's the difference between the Maggies and the hospital. You go from being impotent and you go to being empowered, because you give the users their choice. I think if we can start to create spaces where people feel comfortable, spaces where people can escape, even if we can't afford to do it across the whole hospital. These ideas of creating sensual spaces where your senses are really engaged and brought alive, stimulated through the tactility, the harmonics. I think that these could make a huge difference.
And you've got the DRU now operating.
We have got DRU now operating, which I did supposed to speak about at the beginning, but I slightly forgot.
There you are, you've got the platform.
There's a lot to say. We're setting up a kind of design research unit, but we've so much enjoyed working with all these doctors, not just architects, which is really about trying to look at ways to change the nature of the hospital through a kind of a collective intelligence, but more about the brief and the research rather than purely about the design. And the idea that from that we go on to design. So taking these notions of like the third carer and testing it.
And do you think the reality is that it's going to happen here in the UK, or probably might have to go abroad to demonstrate the concepts?
Well, I think we'll have to see. We're talking a little bit abroad, we're talking here, we're having lots of conversations with the hospital build programme. Nothing yet says commissioned as such, but we'll see. We're really trying to push. It's a big old beast. It's quite hard to and we're tiny little nimble people. So we'll see.
So if you're given all the money in the world now, what would you do with it?
I'd build a hospital and buy a sailing boat.
Fabulous. I think we can open it up to the audience for questions. Hopefully you've been inspired. Over to you there in the white.
I just had a question about whether or not the idea of VR ever came into play in design. Obviously, you've spoken about there's some people who, they might want to look out and see some nice, beautiful trees and birds and bits and pieces, but there are people who would rather be isolated and might find more comfort in a blizzard or a snowy day. And that's something that VR and technologies these days could possibly give. Was that ever something that was thought about at all?
I think that was discussed a lot. One of our panelists, Helen Starr, who's sadly not here tonight, does amazing work in that whole area. But really that was always not as an alternative to looking at a tree out of a window, but more as an alternative to painkillers, for example, where you can use VR to reduce the pain by 40%. 40% seems to be my percentage of the evening, but it's something like that. I think the powers. Or, there's an artist called Matt Pike who's doing this whole series of work around trying to get you to see your pain. And if you can see your pain through kind of anesthesia, what's it called, anesthesia? What do I mean?
That's right.
Anesthesia. I get it confused with the penicillin. Anyway, you can really reduce how the pain feels. So yeah, a lot of work, a lot of really interesting work going on. But also the idea of someone being really stressed, a doctor, a nurse, a janitor, then putting on a headset for half an hour and just going off swimming with the whales as a kind of form of escape, which I think maybe that's close to where you're getting to. But I still think you need a window with a tree.
Just to add to that as well, because I remember we talked very exploratory about loneliness and how VR could help in that sense. especially highlighted during the time of COVID, where people couldn't visit family members. And it was quite exciting when Helen was there and talking about the possibility that you could have a VR headset. And just like you FaceTime and link in to someone else, you could meet in a cafe and have a conversation, and the illusion of someone being there could help fill that void of loneliness. But also another important thing I think you say is, if people want to be alone, the other thing you talk about is flexibility, and you also discussed that, and Ash as well, and sensitivity. So not everyone wants to do the same thing, but just allowing that space for things to be flexible was also things that we discussed.
I think it's also being able to personalise your hospital journey as well. Talking a little bit personally, I've had experiences being carried through hospitals where if you are the most, I don't know, say you're in a bed and a patient has come in just for an x-ray that day, they're in and out within an hour, you've been in hospital for a week and your journey is slightly different. You are the person in the waiting room in the bed or in the wheelchair, you're the less able one. Being able to have something like VR would mean you're able to take your own journey with you, and if you are, you talk about isolation, it's definitely something that can, provide.
But I think what we're really trying to do is to nudge behaviour, and to use design to nudge different. So whether it's VR or whether it is a view or a tree or a piece of material, is that tactility, that nudging of behaviour that we're trying to work on.
Picking up from what you mentioned, I was just wondering, because in one of the slides you mentioned you would want to eliminate the car parks in the basements of the hospitals of this specific project. I was just wondering, and also since what you present kind of gave the idea that the hospital would have like several levels utilized by people who are not necessarily patients, but like just the local community. How were you thinking, and like what implications did you take into consideration to make that project accessible even for those who would, for example, rely on the car as a means of transportation, like those who wouldn't ride a car to the hospital as a luxury, but because they don't have any choice? And how would you also guarantee that the accessibility to the hospital isn't too much to the point that it doesn't start interfering like the flux of like patients in and out of the hospital because it's too overcrowded by other visitors from local community accessing some of the facilities?
I think we have a system of transportation which prioritizes the patients into the hospital, if that's what you mean, from kind of accident, emergency, etc., but also from the park side. So beyond the public, you go off in the hospital and you are there. I think from the perspective of the parking, I think that we can't, the car doesn't really work in the city. We're looking at an urban solution, certainly not as a form of getting to the hospital. I think it becomes very, very complicated. Every time you see people endlessly driving around any hospital car park, it's not, it's really not a solution. More and more you see now with schools where they have no car parks, and it really changes the behaviour around the school, and it reduces the accidents outside the school to do with cars. So we really, need to try to change the behaviour of the motorist in the inner city and places like hospitals and the reliance upon it.
And also often people who have problems, disabled, and need to get to hospitals, they usually have ambulances that will go and collect them from home and bring them. So I guess that sort of system can be augmented and wouldn't necessarily be a limitation by ABE's concept. Thank you. Just over here.
Thank you for a nice presentation. I'm an architect and lecturer from Sheffield University, and I also research on the workspace environment, especially for the well-being of the workers. So I quite like the presentations because he also mentioned about the workers' workspace environment, so important because they have gone through so stressful time, especially they also go through, the same like patients also go through all the machineries and etc. And they need some space for their well-being as well. My question is that when you showed that presentation on the location of the workspace and the workers, where northeast should be for the workers so that most of the patients can get the south and most of the daylight. My question is that, you know that in urban locations like that, it's always difficult, even in north or south, getting a full light because of the high-rise buildings, etc. I know that it's always difficult to get those kind of areas where you have full of greeneries around it. Especially the shadows. Probably you get some buildings when his south side probably blocked by a high-rise building and it's getting shadow. How do you think in the future when you prototype these spaces in different kind of location, urban or semi-urban areas, how do you think these challenges can be tackled?
Well, in a way, we take this block, we make this park, which is a hectare within these drawings, which already gives us a building free zone to an extent. So we're not building in a really congested moment where we need a certain amount of clarity. Otherwise, you will be in the face of the next building.
So just another adding part is that the well-being of the workspaces, if it's north, whether it's possible to even put them in somewhere so that they have at least flexibility to even feel having the south or somewhere they can feel like to go to just for a change, in case they want to change the view, for example, apart from the. So
you're talking about the shadows into the building. You're talking about the building being shadowed by the buildings around it.
Yes.
You're talking about the interior.
Also, for example, if you workspace only being to the north side, not going to get the direct sunlight, for example. If they want to have a sunlight, they have to go towards the south or north or east side of the east or west side of the building. The reason I was saying, because I deal with the other part of the the thermal comfort and the solar and other access of the building. So it's very fascinating, this design, if it's integrated with those parts. I'm sure it's going to fulfill those requirements. But if it can highlight those parts, and would be excellent, because that will fulfill all the other part of the vitamin D, etc., those kind of parameters we can add. I'm sure there's more experts in that, but it will be great. Yeah, like those spaces, like office spaces and things like that.
These spaces,
those spaces.
These spaces here, are all full of light, soft light, like artificial northern light coming in straight, very very shallow. These spaces here are things like staff changing rooms, X-ray rooms, the couchettes. They're all spaces which don't require light. So we're very much coordinated around it. If I go back to see, look, we can. I mean, I'm not going to go into it, but you can see here. If you start 11 large equipment store, 12 pharmacy. So they're all lightless spaces, which require. The only humans in here should be sleeping, or getting stuff out the cupboards.
So when light's needed, there is light.
So when there's light's needed. But I think these have got quite gorgeous, and this waiting area, it's got pretty nice, soft light. I mean, not penetrating deep into it, but it's quite pleasant.
Okay. So
Thank you for all the comments and explanations.
That was the question.
Thanks for the explanations as well. Thank you.
Hi. I'm really curious about the DRU. Especially as you've been speaking about how you've consulted with different professions and patients and that, and where that kind of research is sitting. I only ask that because I'm currently working with Southwest London and mental health hospitals, and people are giving their input, but really having that as a collective source in order for it to be used, because I think as amazing it is to build new, right now a lot of what's happening is going and problem solving the best that can be done, and kind of around guidance on how to do that. So I'm just curious to find out like where that knowledge is sitting and whether you've got it somewhere.
Well, I think that knowledge is sitting very much in, we have this kind of extended collective, and we're looking at a series of different problems. I think you're absolutely right that the indulgence of creating a piece of architecture that resolves all is indulgent, and really we need to be looking at existing spaces. And I think we need to avoid ripping buildings down, and we need to find ways to adapt architecture at all moments. And I think often responding to existing bones can be a really kind of exciting way of creating architectural solutions. But we went about putting together this collective really through kind of networks of people. I'm talking to one person and another person, and then asking them for someone specifically, and they would bring that person in very specifically, and so it would go on. And I think having been kind of a designer, architect, or more designer for 45 years, starting to discover this whole new way of working was so interesting. Not that we didn't do things collectively before, but we didn't create such diverse steering groups as such. So, yeah, steering group sounds too, but this diverse collective, which really was where you would not know, we could not predict where it was going to go. Very non-tokenistic, very real.
Thanks. So you're saying
as a designer, it's really exciting to let go of the handles in a way and flow.
And you're saying that the resource will be very helpful, you think?
Yeah, I think that's what I'm kind of wondering. I know how amazing it is as a designer to kind of step back a little bit and actually get people's stories, which are so complex to unpick and then apply. I'm just really curious about the knowledge that you have collected through the stories that you have spoken to with these different things that have informed this design, and if you have that collected.
We have produced a little book, which is not. We only did a very few. We only produced a couple of hundred at the moment. We're trying to publish it, and we're working on another possible book as well. But there's lots of words in here. I find words quite pesky, but they are all there. Well, so we can, and certainly if you go to dru.com, it's downloadable, in fact.
And in time you will share these ideas so that other people can hopefully
completely
utilize it as well. So we're running out of time. We have to finish. Abe, thank you for an inspiring conversation and presentation, and all the time that you've given and dedicated to this project, but also the Abe Rogers team, Ernesto and Dean and many other people who have contributed to this as well. The collective intelligence, I can see some people are here as well. Thanks for all the input and for everyone for listening. I'm going to end with a quote. The worst of poverty is the poverty of aspiration. Ernest Bevan. And I think with that, Abe, thank you for the aspiration.